From the McCourtney Institute for Democracy on the campus of Penn State University, I'm Michael Berkman.
And I'm Chris Beam, and this is Democracy Works.
Chris, today we're going to talk about an important survey that probes Americans, young and old, about their support for and concerns about American democracy.
Right. It's actually, the results are interesting, and also just the fact of the survey itself and some of the features.
Yeah, it's an interesting partnership.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're going to be talking to Lindsay Lloyd, who is director of the Human Freedom Initiative at the George W. Bush Presidential Center. And what's interesting about he did the survey called the Democracy Project Survey. Elaborate and extensive. They included focus groups. But what's interesting about it is that it's a distinctively bipartisan effort. Right, they worked in collaboration with the Penn Biden Center at the University of Penn, and also with Freedom House, who universally, worldwide regarded as an important arbiter of the condition of human rights around the world. Mm-hmm. And so they did this poll together, and they got polling firms representing both the Republican and Democratic sides of the aisle, and put together this survey.
Yeah, it's like bipartisanship from a bygone era.
I think that's
right.
Right.
A sort of older establishment Republican and
right.
establishment Democrat
Right.
back in the days when we could talk about an establishment that had a kind of bipartisan support.
Right, and it's interesting to ask whether and how that perspective, maybe gone for by perspective, is reflected in the results or in the way that the results are presented. So you and I have both talked about this survey, very famous now, by Yascha Mounk, who at the time was a lecturer at Harvard. He's now at Johns Hopkins. And the survey asks people, is it essential to you to live in a democracy, right?
And it's finding a decline in support for democracy among younger cohorts in multiple countries throughout the Western world.
Right. And so this survey is just about the United States.
But it digs in deeper because it's also using focus groups.
Correct.
And goes into some more detailed questions, including about promoting democracy abroad,
right.
which was not a topic in the Yascha Mounk.
Right, and which is obviously of serious concern to Freedom House, the Penn Biden Center, and the George W. Bush Center. So all that's true. But you're right. The objective is to find out not just what people are how committed they are to democracy, how they feel about democracy, and what they see, what they identify as some of the biggest problems.
Well, it's right. It's trying to do that, but it's also trying. It's also trying to assess the extent to which Americans still support the idea of promoting democracy abroad.
Right, correct.
So there are two things there. One is, how do Americans of different generations, because they do, through their focus groups and some other methods, focus in on younger Americans. Mm-hmm. So how do Americans of different cohorts feel about the state of American democracy? And then how do they feel about the role of the United States in promoting democracy abroad?
Right, that's right. I just want to just say that that one of the cohorts that's split out is among age, but also they identify differences in terms of partisanship and also differences in terms of race and ethnicity, and all of those are, I think, pretty interesting.
They also see younger Americans as feeling a lower sense of efficacy, meaning that what they have to say matters, mm-hmm. Having less confidence in politics as a way to get things done, and less confidence in American political institutions.
Right, and
these are disturbing findings over the long term.
Yeah, I mean,
if they stay this way, but there's no reason to believe they're going to grow out of it in the current environment.
So anyway, I think we've said a significant amount. And
well, let's go to our guest and hear what he has to say about his survey, and then we'll be back.
We'll be back.
This is Jenna Spinelli here today with Lindsay Lloyd. Lindsay, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Jenna. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So we are going to talk today about the Democracy Project and some work that was done regarding feelings of Americans about the condition of democracy and some of the factors that affected that. But before we get to that, I think it would be good to start with some backgrounds. Can you tell us what the Democracy Project is and how it relates to the Bush Center's mission?
Sure. So the Bush Center opened its doors in 2009, and one of the areas that we work on is what we call human freedom, democracy, and human rights programming. And historically, that work had all been focused outside of the United States. We have an active project on North Korea. We do work in Burma. We work with leaders from the Middle East and North Africa and things like that. But several years ago, we, like everyone else, sort of noticed what was happening in American democracy and the fact that our politics were becoming increasingly angry, that there was just a lot of contention, a lot of partisanship, a lot of nastiness, frankly, and wanted to see what we might be able to do about it. We joined forces with two other institutions, one being Freedom House, which is the oldest and I think best known human rights watchdog group in the country, and a new organization, a new startup called the Penn Biden Center, founded by the former vice president and housed at the University of Pennsylvania. And the three of us jointly decided to launch a public opinion research project to sort of find out what is troubling our society, what's troubling our democracy. So over the course of the first part of last year, of 2018, we did a series of focus groups in 4 different cities around the country with different constituencies like small business owners or military veterans or teachers to get that sort of qualitative data, to hear from people in their own words about what they were thinking about our democracy. And then later in the spring, we did a national public opinion poll where we surveyed people around the country on some of these issues, both domestically and internationally. We looked at the health of our democracy, but then also about how Americans feel about the U.S. supporting democracy and human rights outside our borders.
Broadly speaking, how are people feeling about the condition of democracy in the U.S.?
Yeah. So I think the first thing, and it's an important thing, there was a flurry of articles and conversation in the first part of 2017 that Americans were looking for something else, or that generally people living in democratic societies were thinking about alternatives. Yascha Mounk at Harvard University is probably the best known proponent of this. And he put out an article and spoke quite a bit about this phenomenon, saying that that there was an openness to something different, be that a technocratic government or even an authoritarian government or something like that. We did not find that in our survey. The folks that we talked to overwhelmingly felt it was important to them, or very important to them, to live in a democracy. So large numbers, really no significant opening whatsoever to, let's try something else. Now, having said that, the theoretical, 80, 85% are saying it's important to them to live in a democracy. The flip side of that is that our respondents felt that America's democracy was weak and that it's getting weaker. So, not wanting to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but just sort of feeling that America's democracy isn't delivering in the way that it's supposed to, or that it traditionally had. We asked people, is America's democracy getting weaker or getting stronger? Nearly 70%, 68% came back and said it's getting weaker. So, it's great to have that sort of theoretical, conceptual support for democracy, but clearly there's something wrong when you have, over 2/3 of respondents in the country saying that our system is getting weaker.
What role do you see the Democracy Project and the Bush Center playing in trying to address some of the issues that you found in your survey and in the focus groups?
So it's kind of twofold. The other thing, which I didn't really touch on, but the survey also looks at the support for U.S. engagement on democracy and human rights overseas. It was sort of the second half of the survey. And our plans there are a little bit more crystallized at this point. We are starting up a process to put out a policy paper along with some discussion groups, working groups, things like that, on a bipartisan basis to look at democracy and human rights support overseas. It has, frankly, taken a hit under this administration. It has not been a priority for this administration. And we believe, our partners believe, that it's extremely important that the U.S. speak out on behalf of human rights around the world when abuses are happening, and that the U.S. support democracy around the world through rhetoric, through financial support, through many other ways. Our adversaries, if I can put it that way, if you look at China, you look at Russia, are advocating for a different model, for authoritarianism, for a more centralized system. And just as back in the height of the Cold War, when the National Endowment for Democracy was founded, and President Reagan made a famous speech at Westminster in London, talking about the need for Western democracies, for democracies generally, to advocate for their system, for their point of view, and that has largely fallen by the wayside. The funding is still there, is still in place, but that's only because Congress has put it in place over the last couple of years. The administration just hasn't made it a priority. We believe it should be. We believe it's effective. We believe it's essential. And what we found in the survey was that respondents, when we started to talk to them about these issues, agreed that when you make arguments that having more democracies, having a more democratic world makes America safer, makes us more prosperous, that it's the right thing to do, we found strong support across really all demographics. So, as I say, we are working on a policy paper that will make recommendations to Congress, to the administration, the new president, whoever he or she may be, about this issue, why we believe it's important.
Who do you see as your allies to move some of these issues forward and as you said, continue that support for the U.S. Helping to build and sustain democracy abroad?
So I think one of the good news pieces is that on Capitol Hill you still have very strong support across party lines for this. Members of Congress, I think, Republicans and Democrats, are generally supportive of the U.S. continuing this kind of work. As I said, the administration had proposed cutting the budgets pretty dramatically of some of the key programs that fund these projects, groups like the National Endowment for Democracy and funding within the State Department. And Congress has each year put it back in, and in some cases at increased levels over the year before. So I think that's a sign of optimism. The other thing I would point to, which I think is a really interesting phenomenon, is that newer democracies are interested in this work. Countries that were under totalitarian rule in Central and Eastern Europe, for example, have started their own projects to support democracy and human rights overseas. So it's not just that the U.S. is going out and saying, do this. You have a host of countries, all over Europe. Scandinavia has been very active in this area. Australia, Canada, Taiwan, other democracies out there are also undertaking efforts to do this. And it's good that that's happening, but it's also, I think, imperative that the U.S. show leadership on these issues.
There seemed to be broad support for both the U.S. Supporting democracy abroad, but also there was, if I'm recalling it correctly, a sentiment of, well, we should just let other countries do what they want to do. And I'm just wondering how both of those things can simultaneously be true. And I think that they both, rated pretty highly, if I'm recalling.
You're right. And this came out, I think, also in the focus groups that we did. There's a strong sentiment among many people to, fix our problems first, deal with the concerns we have here at home before we do any sort of foreign aid. Foreign aid is never popular. And has never really been popular, going back to efforts like the Marshall Plan after World War II. It was hugely controversial and barely got through. And I suppose that's very natural, but I think there's a couple things at work. One is that we've done a really lousy job of explaining this. When our survey didn't ask this question, but other surveys ask people to estimate what percentage of the federal government goes to foreign aid, and they're wildly off the mark. People think it's 10% of the budget or 20% of the budget, when in fact it's less than 1% of the total federal budget is going to foreign aid. So there's a little bit of education that would be really helpful on that front. But people's concerns are legitimate. It is perfectly legitimate to say we need to deal with our healthcare crisis, or why can't they fix the road that I drive on every day to get to work? But our belief is that we can do both, and that there's a lot of historical precedent for doing this. When you look back at what the founders wrote, they didn't say, we the American people. They said we the people, and there's a universality that's inherent in the Declaration and in the Constitution and so forth, that these rights belong to everyone. So to the extent that we can be supportive of that, I think people will come along. When you talk to people about foreign assistance, like a program like PEPFAR, which has saved countless lives in Africa, people start to understand that a relatively small amount of money has done some enormous good, and they're supportive of it. When you explain to people that in fact democracy promotion, human rights promotion can work, it's not foolproof, but there are success stories that you can point to from around the globe. You look at a country like South Africa, which has transformed itself beyond recognition in 20, 30 years. But on every continent, you can find examples of countries that have chosen the democratic path, where the United States and other democracies have assisted, and that there have been good outcomes. And you talk to people about how those countries are now trading with us. They don't pose a security threat to us, and so forth. And people then, I think, are going to be much more receptive to this kind of work.
President Trump was not mentioned at all in the report, and certainly there's much more to democracy than what happens at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But I'm wondering if the administration came up at all in the survey, or perhaps more likely in focus groups, and what some of those conversations were like.
Yeah, we intentionally did not ask about the approval of the president or any other political figure, in part because this isn't a political poll. It wasn't, the type that would appear on the evening news and say so and so's up by 2% kind of thing. And it was hopefully a little bit more timeless than that. It certainly came up in the focus groups that we did. Those included one group of people that supported the president in 2016. We had another group of people who were supportive of Senator Sanders in the Democratic primary in 2016. So we certainly got some different perspectives, and inevitably, his name came up early and often in the focus group conversations. Totally naturally, and nothing I think particularly surprising. Clearly, the president has some very strong supporters and some equally strong detractors out there, and that colors a lot of people's views on politics more broadly. But as you said, it's democracy is much bigger than who is sitting in the White House at any one time. It really gets to, I think, the local level politics and the importance of that. Again, the sense that democracy delivers. Did my garbage get picked up this week? Have they fixed that pothole? Have they, fixed the crossing lights in front of the school I drive by every day? Those kind of things touch people where they are. And, if they're being neglected, confidence in the system overall, I think, suffers.
And I know that democracy is more than what happens in the White House. Did you get the sense that the people in your focus groups felt that way as well?
Yeah, I did. I think so. Another of the focus groups we did was with local officials, again in Indianapolis. So people who are serving on town councils or as elected judges or tax collectors, that kind of thing. They clearly they had an interesting perspective in that they regretted the lack of engagement that they saw from citizens. That how rare it was to have citizens come to a council meeting. The reluctance of people to serve on juries, things like that were mentioned. Many of these small town and suburban officials, I think, would be delighted to see a big turnout at the city council meeting, or have somebody call them about that pothole or that crosswalk that needs fixing, and said that people weren't engaging on that level. So, I think it's there are a lot of rights that come with living in a democracy, but there are also responsibilities, including being informed and engaged and speaking out when something concerns you.
So, Lindsay, the other thing that we hear a lot about in polling and in the media is the kind of the increasing partisanization or polarization of our country, and people not being able to agree or just kind of talking past each other. Did you see any evidence of, I guess, either of those scenarios in your focus groups, either this, extreme polarization or perhaps people being able to find middle ground on some issues?
Yeah, we certainly did. I mean, you hear this from everybody, regardless of where they are on the spectrum. I think one of the complications is that if I'm a diehard pro-Trump or I'm a diehard anti-Trump person, I think getting rid of partisanship means everybody needs to agree with me. And we heard that at kind of both poles. But most people aren't there. Most people are somewhere in the middle. They may lean one way or lean the other. And I think it's of grave concern. At the local level, this is less of an issue. Obviously, in many states, local elected officials are nonpartisan. But you see this, I think, really across the board, that people are frustrated that Congress or that Washington in particular can't solve problems. And I think it's pretty clear to most people that this era of hyper-partisanship that we're in is one of the key contributing factors to that, because the ideas aren't examined based on the merits. They're examined on the basis of who's proposing them. And I think that just really frustrates people. You look at an issue like healthcare, which is typically the top concern of most Americans, and they don't really care who's behind the proposal. They just want to see it get better. They just want to see it get done. And, we've seen now this ongoing struggle for however many years that if it comes from the other side of the aisle, I'm not going to touch it. And rather than dealing with some of the real issues that are out there, even on things that are much less controversial on the surface, on, how do we deal with the opioids epidemic around the country? And, that becomes a partisan issue. So I think that the voters' frustration is very understandable on this issue. Unfortunately, both of the parties have seen a hollowing out where they've both been sort of dragged further to the extremes. That the old days where you had Rockefeller Republicans or Blue Dog Democrats are largely gone in Congress. So it's a real challenge, and I guess the only answer I've got to that is that people need to think a little bit more differently about how they vote in primary elections, where if you view yourself as being somebody more centrist, then maybe you need to cast your ballot in that way in the primary elections, and reward politicians who are seeking compromise and seeking to work together. But it's tough. It's very, very tough environment out there.
The report does make a couple of recommendations, mostly I would say around messaging. And I'm wondering, kind of, given that there are so many of these big issues that you identified, like racism and like money in politics, did you consider at all trying to make recommendations that might speak more to the substance of those issues as opposed to how people talk about them, or, things like highlighting success stories or things like that?
Right. So the messaging that you talked about, that we did that primarily or really exclusively on the international dimension of this survey, about how do you talk about democracy, how do you talk about human rights support. On the domestic side, we didn't really do that for issues. We didn't say, how should you message healthcare, how should you message campaign finance reform, but we did talk about kind of how you talk about politics, in a sense, to an extent, to really sort of maybe give people a little pause about how do you think about these issues so that you're getting people engaged and not disengaged. We've chatted informally about the potential of doing some follow-up research on this. We haven't made any decisions on that, but I think given this kind of odd coalition of an organization headed by a former Republican president, a former Democratic vice president, and Freedom House. It was less about finding the solutions to these problems and more about kind of how do we talk about them? How do Americans perceive what these issues are out there? I don't have a good answer on campaign finance reform. I don't know that anybody does really, in terms of an easy fix. And how do we get back to that, or something much bigger and more important, racism and discrimination in society? But the other thing I would just note, something I mentioned before about meeting people where they are, talking to them, listening to them in new ways and different ways, as well as the traditional ways, I think is hugely important, so that people start to feel that no, in fact, my vote, my voice can make a difference.
Great. Well, I think that might be about as hopeful of a note that we're going to get at this conversation. So it seems like a good place to draw things to a close. We're going to end, as we always do, with our 4 Mood of the Nation poll questions. So thinking about politics and kind of the state of affairs today, what makes you angry? To me, I think one of the things that I find particularly troubling is the rise of intolerance and the acceptance of intolerance. This country has had a very long journey, and it's an incomplete journey in terms of finding ways that all Americans can participate. Some of the things we've seen in the news over the last couple of years, you look at the incident in Pittsburgh or in Charleston, or right here in Texas, at churches and schools and so forth, the rise and the acceptance of rhetoric that would have been utterly unacceptable just a few years ago, that makes me angry, and I think all Americans have a responsibility to push back against that. And then, what makes you proud?
I think one of the things that makes me proud about our democracy is its ability to adapt. Gets to something I just said, that we didn't start off as a country where everyone enjoyed the same rights, but over time, gradually, and sometimes very painfully, we have adapted the system to ensure that women and people who are not white male property owners in general are able to play a role in the system. And I think for all our flaws, that's something that we as Americans can still take great pride in.
And what makes you worry?
I'm worried about partisanship, and it's a different sort of partisanship than we've seen in recent days. I worked on Capitol Hill for many years back during the Reagan presidency and first Bush presidency. There was a lot of anger and partisanship then, but I think it's taken on a really different character these days. To basically, the mission of the opposition is to block everything that the majority wants to do, and vice versa. And seeing that level of partisanship, not just at the federal level, but at the state level in most of our states as well, is something that gives me concern.
And then finally, what gives you hope?
I would point to, again, these university conversations I had last fall, talking with these young people who were exceptionally well informed and eager to be engaged and had been engaged in different ways. The uptick, small though it may have been, in youth turnout, the growth that we've seen in African American participation and Hispanic participation in elections, I think is something that is a very hopeful sign as this country transitions demographically. I think it's just vital that these voices are heard, and it appears to me that many of them really are eager to be heard.
Lindsay, thanks again for joining us today.
Terrific. Thank you.
All right. Well, so very interesting, and reflects what, Michael, you were talking about this kind of, it was expressing a point of view about bipartisanship and about American foreign policy that is not doing very well in the current political climate.
I think it's a challenge for, Republicans coming out of, say, the tradition of the Bushes, to be able to talk about these things these days, because their party has not moved in a direction that one could argue is pro-democracy. You could say a lot of things about it that might be positive for people, but it doesn't often talk about promoting democracy, either here or abroad.
It's difficult for someone representing the Bush Center to engage these issues, as you say, because they represent a conception of the Republican Party that is at best a minority view now.
But let's commend how important it is that they are trying to symbolically and in practice actually push back against polarization by working with the Biden Center,
right, and that there is a responsible middle, and
they're trying to say that's us,
and a bipartisan conversation that is necessary, that is essential to moving politics, government, and foreign policy forward. The counter argument, and this is one that Jenna has made.
Well, and I think she's making it. I think Lloyd made this point
right,
too.
Which is that to the degree that we focus solely on Donald Trump, we're missing a large part of this American democratic conversation and argument, right? And so I think that's probably true. I also, the counter argument is, one that I've made to Jenna, is that, when the barn is on fire, you worry about getting the fire out, and then you worry about the rest of it.
He also did talk about how the survey found declining support for American institutions among the young, less trust in American. This is a real problem that we're seeing more and more. And the constant attacks on American institutions by the Trump administration contributes to this. The attack on institutions like the media, the attack on institutions like the independent judiciary, the way that the president often talks about courts as sort of his courts or the other courts. I mean, all of this contributes to what this poll is showing us is out there, and it's a problem. And that is that young people are likely to be less trusting and less supportive of institutions. Where does this go over the long term? How do you restore that kind of confidence? I actually have no idea how you restore that confidence.
Yeah, I don't think he does either.
Well, I don't think anybody
I don't think anybody.
Here's where our poll does show something really interesting. We did this about this topic. We saw this a couple months ago. We asked people about their confidence in the FBI. We asked this in a variety of ways. And what we would have expected to see is that Republicans in particular are supportive of law enforcement.
Of course.
I mean, that's how...
Decades.
That is not what we see.
Right.
What we see is that and there is no other way to attribute this except to the president's attacks on the FBI, that Republicans at least have lost confidence in the FBI.
Well, the argument is that we are seeing the partisanization of every aspect of American life. So this is basically yet another manifestation of this argument that we were having before, which is this what's the right way to understand this and to respond to it, right? Is there more to democracy, American democracy, than just Donald Trump and his impacts and his decisions, or is this the only thing that matters for the future of democracy? Is the future continued reign of the Trumpian administration?
Right, and so this survey raises these issues, and it's important that Americans be talking about them. So good for them for doing that.
But it is also true that because of these actions, there are more people more engaged in politics now than there have been for generations, and that includes young people. And it doesn't just mean reading the New York Times or watching MSNBC or Fox News. It means people are understanding a sense of responsibility about the condition of their democracy, and they're acting appropriately.
Yeah, absolutely. And he made that point, and
yes.
it's important to emphasize that the fact is people voted. They voted in record numbers,
and they're going to protest, and
we're seeing engagement in
local politics and writing letters.
It's hard to imagine if Hillary Clinton had won.
Yes,
that we would be seeing. We'd see the same gridlock in Congress. Nothing would be getting done. It would be the same commitment that there was towards when Obama was president, which is that nothing's going to get done. But because of this, you have seen a renewed engagement and a renewed sense among Americans that politics is important and that democracy is important.
So, I think this is the flip side or the good side of understanding our democracy as weak and getting weaker. There's no sense among Americans any longer that this train runs itself and that we don't have to concern ourselves with it. We can go and do our own thing. We now understand that democracy is, even 200 years plus in, has a certain precariousness to it, and that it requires a commitment on part of all of us to make it run well. And if that is the message that comes out of this survey and out of where we are politically right now, well, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Exactly.
So thank you very much to Lindsay Lloyd for his work and for the survey and for coming on the show. Thanks to Jenna for the interview. I'm Chris Beam.
I'm Michael Berkman.
Thanks for listening.
Democracy Works is produced by the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State and WPSU Penn State. Our hosts are Michael Berkman, Chris Beam, and me, Jenna Spinelli. Andy Grant is our engineer, and Mark Stitzer is our editor. Additional support comes from Emily Reddy, Shireen Stanford, Craig Johnson, and the rest of the team at WPSU. For detailed show notes and discussion questions for each episode, visit our website at democracyworkspodcast.com. And if you like what you heard today, please consider rating or reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.